Tomorrow, a House committee is going to consider extremism and fake news. I'm worried about this hearing because two members of Congress recently called on satellite and cable providers to take conservative networks off their platforms, to censor Fox, Newsmax, and others. You'll hear why that violates the First Amendment, if not in letter of the law, in the spirit of the law. You'll hear why it's wrong on the Dershow. Tomorrow, an important House subcommittee is going to start conducting hearings on the internet and on fake news and on a range of issues relating to what we've been talking about a lot on the Dershow. I'll read you from the news release. On Wednesday, the House Subcommittee on Communications and Technology of the Committee on Energy and Commerce is scheduled to hold a hearing on disinformation and extremism in the media. Well, you might think we would welcome that, disinformation, extremism in the media, but from everything I can see, it's going to be extremely one-sided. In the lead-up to the committee hearing, two Democratic members of Congress from the Silicon Valley area, Representatives Anna Dershow and Jerry McNerney, have sent letters to all of the cable and satellite companies that have on their allowed to be broadcast through their satellites, etc., Fox News and Newsmax and one other conservative channel. And in the letter, they are questioning whether or not AT&T and the other satellite companies and cable companies should be allowing Fox and Newsmax even to be on television. That's going to be a subject of the hearing, at least according to these two Democratic censors. And in the letter, they ask the following of each of these carriers. Are you planning to continue carrying Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN on Universe, DirecTV, ATT, both now and beyond any contract renewal date? If so, why? It's a real challenge to these companies. These two members of Congress have already called for a return to the fairness doctrine that would require every channel, cable or ordinary, to have both sides of every issue presented. Look, that's an interesting debate we could have someday. They used to apply to regular network channels that if they presented one side of a story, they'd have to present the other side. There are still some restrictions during election campaigns. If you present one candidate, you may have to present the other candidate. But the fairness doctrine was abolished during the Reagan administration, and there are some liberal censors in Congress who want to bring back the fairness doctrine in order to stifle debate, not in order to encourage debate. It's interesting that the letter, which is very testy in its tone, only focuses on conservative media. It doesn't in any way talk about the unfairness or the imbalance that you see regularly on CNN, on MSNBC, indeed even on PBS. You don't see any of that in the letter. It's only focused on conservative media. And the focus, of course, is on challenges to the election and how the events of January 6th were described, as well as issues relating to COVID. These congressmen and women don't like the way Fox and Newsmax and others on the conservative side have presented the news. They're very satisfied the way CNN and MSNBC have presented the news, so they want to only investigate the conservative media. This sounds exactly like the kind of McCarthyism I experienced as a young man when House committees and Senate committees started to investigate the TV networks because they thought they were too liberal and they thought they were promoting communism and socialism, etc. And as a result of that, many of the TV networks and stations joined what was called red channels. That is a private organization that precluded anybody from being on their network who had any association with communism, with the left. Some of you may have seen the early Woody Allen film called The Front, which described what happened during McCarthyism when blacklisted or red-channeled writers and actors, but particularly writers, couldn't submit scripts under their own names, so they had to get fronts. They had to get people who had never been in politics to submit the scripts. Some of the most distinguished writers, Dalton Trumbo and others who were very famous in Hollywood, were not allowed to submit scripts because of their leftist leanings. And I think we're seeing that today. If these two members of Congress are allowed their way, if they can persuade AT&T and other cable and satellite carriers not to carry Fox News and Newsmax, it will be essentially government censorship. Look, there's an answer to this. If you don't like Fox, turn it off. If you don't like Newsmax, turn it off. Your television carries MSNBC, and it carries CNN, and it carries PBS. By the press of a button, you make the decision. It's called the open marketplace of ideas. But these two members of Congress want to shut down these two stalls in the marketplace. They don't want you to be able to buy their product. They don't want you to be able to listen to their assessment of the news. They don't even want you to be able to flip the channels between CNN and Fox. I often do that when I'm watching, for example, State of the Union message or some important speech given by a president or a member of Congress. I will flip between CNN and MSNBC and Fox and Newsmax just to get a sense of how differently they cover the same story. And sometimes it's as if you were watching two separate stories. They don't even give you the facts. I think I've mentioned before when PBS had a special on Trump and described the two controversial, but two of the most controversial speeches he made, the one at Charlottesville and the one in the Capitol. They deliberately, willfully, maliciously, and with malice of forethought left out the qualifications. They had President Trump saying there are fine people on both sides, leaving out what he said right after that. I don't include among those fine people neo-Nazis or white nationalists. They should be condemned all the time. Left that out. Or when President Trump called for people to march on the Capitol and fighting spirit and show this and don't let them do this and the only way we'll regain our country, they deliberately left out the part where he said, and I know you will walk with me to the Capitol and demonstrate peacefully and patriotically and have our voices heard. Left out. So, that's not just a matter of opinion. That's denying your viewers the facts necessary for them to make up their own mind. I still have friends who believe that President Trump said in Charlottesville, there are fine people among the Nazis and white supremacists. There are people who actually believe that. I got an email yesterday from a friend, very reasonable guy, who basically said that he was just not aware because he watched CNN and MSNBC and PBS. He was not aware that the president explicitly said, I don't include among the fine people neo-Nazis and white nationalists. They should be universally condemned. They just don't know that. They don't know that Trump, when he spoke at the Capitol, said peacefully and patriotically so your voices could be heard. That may not be enough to persuade them. It's not enough to persuade me. I think that President Trump could have done more at Charlottesville. You know my views. My views is if you're a person of the right, you have to go out of your way to condemn right-wing extremism. And if you're a person of the left, you have to go out of your way to condemn left-wing extremism. Do I think the president did enough at Charlottesville? No, that's my opinion, however, based on all of the facts that I heard, every single one of the facts that I heard. I heard him talking about the statue of Lee. I heard him talking about statues of Washington and Jefferson. And a journalist said, yeah, but Washington and Jefferson are different. And he said, no, they own slaves. You could agree or disagree, but if you hear everything, then you have a right to your opinion. But if television networks deprive you of information necessary to arrive at reasonable opinions, that's a form of self-censorship. But we're not hearing anything from these two congressmen about the networks on the left side that deny listeners and viewers the right to see and hear the whole picture. So what I anticipate on Wednesday is, because the majority will be Democrats on the subcommittee, all the subcommittees will have majority Democrats. It'll be close because of the 50-50 split in the Senate, but the House won't be close. It'll be a very substantial majority among the subcommittee members. I expect we'll hear a very one-sided presentation and an attack just on the conservative media. Look, I'm not personally conservative. This is not a brief for conservatism. This is a brief for freedom of speech. This is a brief for fairness. This is a brief for the open marketplace of ideas, so conservatives can decide what they want to decide. Liberals can decide what they want to decide. Radicals and extremists can listen to whatever they want to listen to. That's America. In America, members of Congress don't go around telling cable providers what channels to put on and what not to. That's Pravda. That's what's going on today in Hong Kong with China. That's what goes on in some South American countries. That's what goes on in Belarus and in Cuba. It's not what's supposed to go on in America. It's a shame on these two members of Congress for focusing solely on channels they don't agree with, channels that don't support them, channels that don't support their party, channels that don't support their majorities in the House and the Senate. You know, if you don't like what's on a channel, create your own channel. You're in Silicon Valley, do your own thing. Or if you can't do that, switch the channel. Listen to a channel that gives you what you want to hear. The problem with so much in the media today is that they're trying to sell their soap, they're trying to sell their commercials by giving people what they want to hear. If you're on the left, we're going to tell you just what you want to hear. We're going to leave out the parts that will make you uncomfortable, that will make it complex, that will make it nuanced. The last thing you want is nuanced complexity. No, Trump's bad, all the time. We'll give you that if we're CNN. We'll give you that if you're MSNBC. Trump bad all the time. Nothing he's done is ever good. Nothing, zero. You're going to get that. And maybe you'll get the opposite on some of the other channels. Trump's good. Everything he does is good. What the Democrats do is bad. Unfortunately, that's the way television has emerged. Walter Cronkite couldn't get a job today on network television. He's too fair. He's too objective. He's too nuanced. I knew Walter Cronkite. I knew him when he was on Martha's Vineyard. I had no idea what his politics was. He never expressed his personal political views on the air, off the air occasionally, but they were very moderate. But today, you couldn't get on the air if you have that kind of nuanced, moderate point of view. What everybody wants is to hear what they want to hear. They don't want to be complicated. They don't want any cognitive dissonance. They don't want to know that Trump did some bad things and also some good things. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that their football team or their baseball team or their basketball team is partly good, partly bad. They want to root for their team, and that's the way politics has occurred. It's worse because as a sports fan, I'm critical of the way the Red Sox have been managed. I'm critical of the way the Celtics have been coached. I'm critical, certainly, of the way the New England Patriots have traded and allowed Brady to get away. So I'm willing to criticize teams I root for, but CNN is not, and MSNBC is not. And maybe some of the conservative channels are not either. That's for the public to judge. That's up to the public to decide how to deal with these kinds of issues. So watch for that hearing tomorrow. Be very cautious. Be very concerned. Expect you will hear a one-sided point of view. It's one thing to hear one-sided points of view in Congress. It would be quite another thing if cable networks actually were canceled, if Fox and Newsmax actually were taken off some satellite or cable providers. That would be real censorship. And if it came at the behest of members of Congress, it could raise serious First Amendment issues. So I hope that these channels are preparing legally and in every other way for an attack, because it's coming. It's coming. And it's an attack not only on Newsmax and Fox, it's an attack on you and me. It's an attack on you if you're conservative and want to hear those channels. It's an attack on me because I want to flip the channels. I want to hear what every channel is saying. I don't want to be limited to CNN, MSNBC, and PBS. I want the widest array of stalls in the open marketplace of ideas, something these members of Congress are trying to deny me. So stay tuned. We're going to follow these hearings, and we're going to see if these two members of Congress get their way, and if they persuade satellite and cable providers to engage in the kind of censorship that McCarthyism practiced two-thirds of three-quarters of a century ago. So stay tuned. You're going to hear from me in opposition to censorship, whether it comes from the right, the left, or the censor. Before we go to questions, I want to do an update on what I've said in previous shows. You've heard me rail against prosecutors who target people. We talked the other day about targeting former President Donald Trump, that the Attorney General of New York ran on a platform of investigating him and prosecuting him. Now we're seeing a campaign for District Attorney of New York. Cyrus Vance has not announced that he's going to run for re-election, and he's not raising money, so everybody's assuming that he's going to retire after the end of this term and that there'll be an election, and there are more than half a dozen candidates running. And there was a debate the other day, and I have to tell you, I was very pleased with the debate. You don't often hear me being pleased with anything or me praising people, but I was pleased with the outcome of the debate because, at least according to reports in the New York Times, the candidates were all asked one question repeatedly. Are you going to prosecute Donald Trump? We want to know. We want to vote for you if you're going to prosecute Donald Trump. If you're not going to prosecute Donald Trump, we're not going to vote for you. And apparently each of the candidates, I did not see the debate, I'm only recounting what I read in the newspapers, each of the candidates said it would be inappropriate for us to comment about who we're going to investigate, who we're going to prosecute. We have to see the evidence. We have to make a decision based on the evidence. That was the right answer. Letitia James gave the wrong answer. She gave an answer that raises deep concerns about the administration of justice, running on a platform of targeting somebody, running on a platform of getting somebody. I don't care if you're running on a platform to get former President Trump or to get Governor Cuomo. It's wrong either way. You don't target people and then gather the evidence and try to find proof that they're guilty. You follow the evidence where it takes you. You don't hire special people to come in and specially investigate targets. And so I'm hoping that whoever wins, I don't have a candidate in the race, whoever wins the Democratic nomination for the District Attorney of Manhattan, and of course in Manhattan, whoever wins the Democratic nomination wins the election. There's not even a Republican who's announced running. That whoever does that will have an open mind and will call off the people who are specially assigned to get Trump and just look to see what the evidence shows and where the evidence takes them. If the evidence points to criminality, you look at the quality of the evidence, you see if it's sufficient, and you make a prosecutorial decision. Basically, that's what Attorney General designate Merrick Garland said during his confirmation hearings. He's going to follow the evidence. He's not going to tell in advance who he's going to prosecute, who he's not going to prosecute. That's the way prosecutors should operate. I hope we can return to the day where prosecutors weren't always running for office, weren't always trying to do things based on what will get them the most votes, how many notches they can get in their belt, who to prosecute. Make sure you get the right people. Make sure the right people are people who are unpopular in the community. And I hope we'll see a time when prosecutors return to the day, if there ever was such a day, since we've had elected prosecutors in our country, where the decision and the criteria whether to prosecute or not is guilt or innocence, rather than political benefits, political advantage from prosecuting a case. So We're going to come back and talk about lots of these issues. We're going to talk about what's going on in terms of efforts to censor conservative media, or if it were liberal media, I'd have exactly the same point of view. We're going to talk about efforts to target politicians, whether they be former presidents or current governors. In this show, on the Dershow, we have one goal: fairness, fairness, fairness. The road to fairness is due process, the right to counsel, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. All of those are designed to guarantee fairness. They're not designed to assure outcomes one way or the other. They're designed to assure a fair process. And you're always going to hear me advocating a fair process on this show. And I hope you will call in with your comments about how to assure a fair process. You know, there are many conservatives today who want to make sure that we go after the people who produced the Russia hoax. And there are people on the left who want to go after people who are part of the Trump administration. I don't have that agenda. I want to go after criminals. I want to make sure that the public is safe from criminals who endanger our safety. That's as a citizen. As a defense lawyer, my role is very different. If I have a client, I'm going to defend the client vigorously, zealously, ethically, and to the limits of my ability. But we all have different roles. The prosecutor's job is to prosecute the most dangerous people, the ones who pose the greatest danger of victimization to the public. The role of the defense attorney is to defend them by ethical means. And the role of the public is to oversee both and to make sure that both do their jobs in the interests of justice. So let's turn now to your calls, your comments, your wits. That completes the Dershow. Let's begin with our first caller of the day.
Professor Dershowitz, this is Arnold from Queens, New York, an admirer of yours and a longtime avid listener. I know how strongly you support the sovereignty and the security and the existence of the State of Israel. And I, too, am in your category of being a massive supporter and a loyalist to Israel. Because of the fact that I know how you feel about Israel, and it disturbs me to hear how you're comfortable with President Biden in the way he's currently handling himself, trying to renew negotiations with Iran, a massive world leader in the support of terrorism, and has in its constitution the destruction of the State of Israel. And we know under the previous regime in which he was vice president, Iran was covertly refining uranium and planning to build an atomic weapon in spite of their vows not to do this. So I don't know how we can negotiate with these terrorists. And in addition, I know he's willing to speak to Abbas, who, as part of Hamas, has in its charter the destruction of the State of Israel also. While I wish President Biden well and hope he succeeds in all his endeavors, please tell me why I shouldn't be nervous about his aligning himself with two massive potential threats to Israel in view of your love for and support of Israel, which I share. Thank you respectfully, and hoping you'll address this on the air. I will eagerly await your response. Thank you, Professor.
You shouldn't not be nervous. Being nervous is exactly the right approach to the Biden administration's policy toward Iran. I'm nervous. I am encouraged by the fact that Biden has said he wouldn't eliminate the sanctions and return to the deal unless Iran changed it, made it longer and stronger, and included in the prohibitions against rockets capable of delivering nuclear weapons, and also prohibitions on exporting terrorism. It's interesting that several former leaders of Israeli intelligence, I think the deputy director of the Mossad and some other leading intelligence people, have said that they think it would be a good idea to get back to the deal with conditions. If there are valid inspections, reduction in the capacity to produce the elements of a nuclear bomb, elimination of the support for terrorism. So I think there are some in Israel from the national security operation that are in favor of coming back to the deal on these conditions. Secretary of State Blinken has also said that they're not going to go back to the deal unless it gets longer and stronger. So be nervous, keep an open mind, put pressure on the administration. Don't let them go back to the Obama deal, which was a disaster. It was a disaster when it was done. It would be a disaster to go back to it now. I think Biden knows that. I think he feels some sense of loyalty to those who made the deal, including the president under whom he served. I'm a little nervous that Wendy Sherman, who made the deal, is the second in command in the State Department. I'm a little less nervous that John Kerry, who also was very instrumental in the deal, is now the environmental secretary. I think that has less of a direct involvement in Iran. But we have to push very hard. And I, as a Democrat, have to push especially hard on the Biden administration to make sure they don't go back to the terrible deal. Remember, I wrote a book about it, The Case Against the Iran Deal. And I'm hoping to write a book, The Case in Favor of the New Deal. If it's a good deal, I'm going to be open-minded about it. But if it's a bad deal, I will reissue the old book with a new introduction explaining why the new deal is no better than the old deal. I hope I can write a new book and not the old book. But it's a great call, very important point you make, and be nervous.
Good evening, Professor. First off, I want you to know that I subscribe and I definitely pay my tuition. I talk you up everywhere. Wonderful program. Now, for a question. I gather from your implication about Laurenti Beria that there was only a desire to prosecute and there was no evidence of any kind, no threshold of doubt that needed to be investigated and cleared up. But in the case of Governor Cuomo, do we not have serious information in our hand already with the remarks of his young lady secretary, who has been very close to him? Does not that provide enough implication for an investigation to go forward? Now, you complain about Mr. Trump, and I understand that situation. But we do have prosecutorial discretion. Mm-hmm. My question is simply, where does the line draw where we have too little evidence or sufficient evidence to commence an investigation?
It's a great question. It's a question that I taught about for many years when I taught prosecutorial discretion in first-year criminal law and in seminars and advanced courses. Where to draw the line is very difficult. One thing that is clear is you shouldn't target people in advance before you have the evidence, and then search for the evidence. In the Lavrenti Beria Stalin situation, they were either making up evidence or, the laws were so vague and open-ended that you could find something on somebody anytime. I've mentioned my friend Harvey Silverglate's book, 3 Felonies a Day, where he demonstrates that the laws today are so accordion-like and open-ended, you can find something on anybody who's had a complicated business life. As far as Cuomo is concerned, the evidence seems overwhelming that he did something that was wrong. But whether it was criminal or not is a much, much different question. The line between sin and crime is what divides totalitarian countries, or even religious totalitarian countries, the Inquisition, etc., from democracies. And so I haven't seen the evidence of crime by Cuomo. I've seen the evidence of wrongdoing. I've seen evidence that might raise questions as to who somebody would want to vote for or whether he should be appointed to a high position in the Biden administration. Those are all fair questions, but I want to see more evidence of criminal conduct before we start searching for criminal evidence. The same thing is true, I think, of Trump, and I want to be very clear that I apply my analysis across partisan lines.
So today, on today's show, you talked about going after people like a real witch hunt where you go after someone and find their crimes. But when we're talking about Donald Trump, there are so many crimes that he has been accused of and that were set in motion before he became president and during his presidency. So I don't think you're making a distinction between going after someone to find a crime and prosecuting Trump for the crimes that he already committed but was not prosecuted for because he was a president. That's it.
Look, you make a good point. If he had committed crimes and they didn't go after him solely because he was a sitting president, and at least under the most accepted interpretation of the Constitution, you can't prosecute a sitting president. That's a valid point. But I haven't seen the evidence of the crimes. I've seen smoke. I've seen mirrors, but I haven't seen the fire. I haven't seen the proof that there were any crimes. Certainly he didn't commit a crime in the Capitol that day when he said, I expect you'll march with me peacefully and patriotically so that your voices could be heard. He certainly didn't commit a crime in Charlottesville where he expressed the point of view that many share, opposition to the tearing down of statues, whatever side you are on that one, protected by the First Amendment. So I don't know what crimes we're talking about. Crimes require that you violate a specific statute with both an actus reus, that is a criminal act, and a mens rea, a criminal mind, an intent to commit these crimes. And so I have to first see what the crime that's being investigated is and then see whether the evidence supports that crime. It's not enough for me to hear that, well, he must have committed a lot of crimes both before and since he served as president and while he served as president. Where's the beef? Where's the evidence? Show me the money, to use any of these cliches. I want to see the evidence before I will agree with you that there ought to be a search for additional evidence of crime. Once you have evidence of crime, you can search for additional evidence. I have no problem with that. But I don't want to see people targeted, whether they're on the right or left, Democrat, Republicans, because of who they are and what they've done politically, and then try to find the crimes to justify the investigation. That's what I think has been going on. And if you can show me differently, I have an open mind.
Hey, Professor Dershowitz. This is Peter Combs calling from Gloucester, Massachusetts. And I was just watching you today talking about the investigation, the new one in New York against Trump. And what confuses me is, where's the probable cause? How can a judge issue this sort of order without probable cause? And the IRS has seen Donald Trump's tax returns for years. Presumably, they've investigated every inch of them. And if he's committed a crime, why haven't they reported it so far? That is their obligation. From what I've been told by my own attorney many times over the years, be honest with your taxes because they'll turn you in. And if Trump has done something wrong, why hasn't he been turned in? His tax returns are no big mystery to them. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on it. Love your program. Love your program. Keep it up. Very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments. I mean, you have very, very important points there. Of course, always file your tax returns legally, fairly, equitably. I have a rule. I tell my accountant, I'm prepared to make a contribution to the United States government. When in doubt, pay. When in doubt, give them the money. I'd rather not go up to the line. You're entitled to go up to the line. My policy is don't go up to the line. If there's any doubt, pay it. And I think that's a good policy. Whether or not there were tax violations, you're right. If the IRS found any on the face of the returns, they would report it to the criminal division of the Justice Department or the tax division. But sometimes you can't find it on the face of the filings. You have to go beneath the face and do an investigation. One point of not correction, but clarification. You talk about probable cause. You don't need probable cause for a subpoena. You need probable cause for a search warrant. That is, if you want to break into somebody's home, you need probable cause. A judge has to sign a warrant. But for a subpoena, you don't need probable cause. The standards are much lower. They're very hard to define what the standards are. It has to be relevant. And because, remember, a search warrant is ex parte. They just break into your house. You have no opportunity to contest it. So the judge is the one who's supposed to be protecting you. But a subpoena, you can challenge it, as President Trump did. Not only did he challenge subpoenas against him, but the subpoena that he challenged and lost in the Supreme Court was a subpoena directed against his accountant, and yet he had standing to challenge that. And so you don't need probable cause for a subpoena, but you need to pass the threshold of relevance, and it can't be overly burdensome. There's a whole range of criteria, none of which are clear. And for the most part, courts support those who issue the subpoena, particularly when they're prosecutors. But look, I think you make a good point. People have been looking into Trump's finances for many, many years, before he was president, while he was president, and since. And if the crimes haven't popped out at you at this point, the likelihood that they will actually discover rather than manufacture a crime are, I think, pretty slight.
This is Andrew calling from Connecticut. There's a trend in recent months that's become very concerning, where corporations, governments, and educational institutions are requiring their participants to attend anti-bias racial type training stuff, for lack of a better term. And to the extent that these courses teach white people bad, brown people good, whatever else, sort of kind of thing, teaching. And it's a horrifying trend. And I think if we rewind the clock 90 years and say, you know what, it's early 1930s, and you see where this slow crescendo is going, where they've got a storyline that you're a victim, it's someone else's fault, and they need to pay. So imagine for a moment when they use these terms so flippantly, like white privilege, right? Replace the word white with Jewish privilege. Now, I understand you're tough and you can take it, and I'm trying my best to tread lightly, but you get the idea where all this is going. You just replace those words and you realize, holy moly, it's the same playbook.
I think you make a very powerful point. I am very critical of these kind of moral retraining programs where people have to take loyalty oaths. The University of Chicago has basically made people take loyalty oaths to a commitment to their concept of racial justice. People can have a variety of views of racial justice. I take the Martin Luther King view. I hope for the day that my children and grandchildren will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the quality of their character. That's my definition of equality. There are those who say, no, equality can't occur unless you have black privilege replacing white privilege, racially based affirmative action in all spheres of life. Reasonable people could disagree with how you approach racial justice and equality. And when reasonable people could disagree, there's no room to have these kinds of forced moral imperatives and loyalty oaths and make people accept just one view of racial justice over other views. So I join in your skepticism and concern about these programs, and these programs can be very demeaning. There's a case now in the Bronx where somebody had to resign under pressure because she, who is, I think, half Latino and half Jewish, I may have my facts wrong, wanted to tell her students about how members of her family were killed in the Holocaust. And that didn't fit into the program as it was seen there. And she refused to make some kind of salute that suggested black power or something. And she had all kind of problems as the result of it. I'm not now certifying that that's an accurate description of what happened. I'm just telling you what I read about in the newspapers. And those stories, they're anecdotal, are of great concern. People have the right to their opinion and their views on how to achieve racial justice. Now, they don't have the right to practice racial injustice. They don't have the right to discriminate, to actively discriminate, but they have the right to hold whatever views they choose to hold on these subjects. And I get very nervous with loyalty tests because today the loyalty tests are in favor of equality. One can easily imagine a situation where they're against it. Take, for example, a proposal that's been made recently that colleges should represent the demography of a community, so that a college in New York should have only a very small percentage of people who are Jewish, or another small percentage of people who are Asian, and a much larger percentage of people who are Black and Latino, reflecting the demography. That's the way it was in the former Soviet Union. when there were quotas. Jews were 2% of the population, so they were allowed to have 2% of the seats in universities. Tatars were so-and-so percentage, so they had. That's not academic. That's not diversity. That's just a quota system, and quota systems are inherently unfair to the individual. And if we had a school that imposed racial quotas based on prevalence in the community, and people oppose that, as I would we be fired? Would we have to take moral retraining courses? All of these are very dangerous and a slippery slope, and I think it's right to be cautious and critical and skeptical of them, even though they're well-intentioned. Hey, what wonderful phone calls. Again, another seminar. Great questions. I hope the answers were as good as the questions. Tomorrow, we're going to have some great questions as well from me to two of the lawyers who defended former President Donald Trump in the Senate trial. We're going to hear from Michael Vanderveen, who presented the First Amendment issue quite effectively on the floor of the Senate. And we're going to hear from David Heim, who worked behind the scenes and wrote the briefs on the First Amendment. And you're going to hear the questions I'm going to ask them about their defense of the First Amendment, whether they think they did anything unethical by presenting what 144 scholars called a legally frivolous argument. You'll hear why the argument was anything but frivolous on the Dershow. An important part of the Dershow is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on the Dershow.